Hi, I'm Jackson Bird, and welcome to the next installment of my Trans Dudes from History series. If you haven't watched the first video, I urge you to pause this, click on this card to go watch the introduction, and then come back and watch this one. That first video contains some important context and disclaimers about how we view potentially trans people throughout history. So, continuing chronologically where Volume 1 left off, by the early 20th century, the study of sexology was really taking off, especially in Europe, just as the medical field in general was also undergoing rapid innovations. And two men who took full advantage of that perfect storm were physicians Alan Hart from the US and Michael Dillon from the UK. Alan Hart was born in Oregon in 1890, and after a tomboyish childhood, graduated from college with top marks and a secret but committed girlfriend. Eventually, he went on to medical school and was dumped by his girlfriend, where he tried to find any hints of his feelings about his gender in his textbooks. And after a time, he started seeing a physician named J. Allen Gilbert, who, after evaluating Hart, decided there was nothing that could be done psychologically for Hart's desire to live as a man, so the two of them might as well work to change Hart's physical appearance so that he could be read in society as a man. This included removing Hart's uterus in 1917, making him the first man in the US to undergo a hysterectomy. Hart finished medical school and worked mostly as an X-ray technician throughout his life, but was often hopping from job to job, possibly after being outed. Nevertheless, he managed to pioneer a new method of screening for tuberculosis by using X-ray photography, a method that would save countless lives, and he even wrote 4 medical-themed novels, including one, The Undaunted, which seems to be semi-autobiographical. Hart said of his transition, "For years I had been unhappy. With all the inclinations and desires of the boy, I had to restrain myself to the more conventional ways of the other sex. I have been happier since I made this change than I ever have in my life, and I will continue this way as long as I live." Hey, Jack from the future here. I had a bit of an audio problem with this next segment that I didn't notice for a couple of weeks, and I couldn't be bothered to reshoot the whole video, so pardon this brief lapse in continuity while I tell you about this next dude from history. So around the same era as Dr. Alan Hart, another white doctor from a privileged class background was going through a similar experience on the other side of the pond. Born into an aristocratic British family in 1915, Michael Dillon, later known as Lobzang Jivaka, was raised by his aunts in a situation that sounds a bit like the beginning of James and the Giant Peach. Eventually, he went to Oxford, where he excelled at rowing, and began dressing in increasingly more masculine fashions. He started driving a motorcycle, and after university, got a job in a lab literally dissecting brains. Like Hart, he may have been attracted to the medical field in order to better understand his own feelings. After being rejected from the Women's Auxiliary Air Force at the start of World War II because he was seen as too mannish to sleep in the women's dorm, Dillon managed to get his hands on some testosterone pills from a doctor who was originally going to experiment on Dillon but got cold feet, so Dillon began the regimen on his own, without having much of an idea what might happen, making him the first trans man we know of to have intentionally undergone hormone replacement therapy. Later, he would also become the first trans man to undergo phalloplasty, or the construction of a phallus, a surgery performed on him over a period of 3 years by the famous Dr. Harold Gillies. Gillies is known as the father of plastic surgery, having performed thousands of surgeries on wounded soldiers in both world wars, as well as on intersex individuals, which is precisely why he had some idea of how he might be able to construct a penis for Dillon. Before that, Dillon had also had top surgery, and the surgeon that performed that managed to write a doctor's note so that Dillon could change his birth certificate. And it's worth pointing out here that Dillon was able to access all of this revolutionary, experimental, first-time stuff because he was a white aristocrat. He had money to throw around, and afforded a certain level of respect despite his perceived eccentricities. And it also helped that he had a bit of a medical background, so the doctors were impressed with his knowledge and kind of wanted to talk shop with him. But again, he only had that education because of his access to wealth. Anyways, Dillon was also, for a time, in a relationship with Roberta Cowell, a race car driver and World War II fighter pilot who became the first British woman to undergo gender affirmation surgery, performed by Dr. Gillies. following the orchidectomy that she received from Dillon, who was not a licensed physician at the time of that procedure. She eventually dumped him though, which, like, good for her. He doesn't seem to have treated her or any women too well. He was pretty open about strategically becoming a misogynist to repel women because he was scared of any of them finding out about his birth-assigned sex and inability to give them children biologically. Yeah, there's a lot of complicated yikes happening there. Dillon did eventually become a physician and worked in Ireland and then on a Navy ship for a number of years after he was outed via a discrepancy between Burke's peerage and Debrett's peerage, books that Downton Abbey fans will be familiar with. They basically just list out family trees and inheritance among the aristocracy in Britain. But anyways, after this unintended notoriety, he fled to India and then Tibet, becoming ordained as a Buddhist monk, apparently the first white European man to be ordained in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. Not too long after, though, he died of unknown circumstances at the age of 47. Coincidentally enough, the very same year that Alan Hart passed away, in 1962. Before he passed, however, also like Hart, he wrote a number of books. One, a memoir called Out of the Ordinary, A Life of Gender and Spiritual Transitions, was republished in 2016 with a foreword by Susan Stryker. But it's his book Self, a study in ethics and endocrinology that really had the potential to change the world, had it ever found a wide audience. Without ever mentioning himself, Dillon, in Self, outlines his proposed treatment of people who transcend gender bounds, writing that recent research had shown, and here he's likely referring at least in part to the research he was conducting on his own body, quote, treatment by hormone injection might make a change, incomplete, it is true, and unproductive save in one respect, and that respect is after all the important one, namely, the achievement of a tolerably happy life for the individual concerned. But is this not an end worth striving after? Surely, where the mind cannot be made to fit the body should be made to fit, approximately at any rate, to the mind, despite the prejudices of those who have not suffered these things. The idea that trans people are best served by social acceptance and, in some cases, physical transition rather than psychiatric treatment was a very new idea, and it's one that wouldn't hit the mainstream medical field for several more years. But now, back to slightly younger Jack for the rest of the video. Living roughly around the same time as Michael Dillon was American jazz musician Billy Tipton. His band, the Billy Tipton Trio, recorded 2 full-length albums in 1957 that sold pretty decently, although Tipton would later turn down bigger opportunities, which some people think may have been out of a desire to keep a low profile. Tipton lived as a man from his late teens until his death without any of the women he was in long-term relationships with, his 3 adopted sons, or his bandmates knowing that he had been assigned female at birth until the time of his death. There is an incredible documentary coming out soon called No Ordinary Man that looks just absolutely stunning, and it was co-directed by, written by, and stars many very talented trans people. I'll put a link to the trailer in the description box so you can check it out. Billy Tipton gets a lot of attention for many reasons. In part, his family ended up talking to the press and appearing on talk shows following his death in 1989, which was a really crucial period for trans visibility. There's a whole generation of transmasculine people who attribute news about Billy Tipton as being the first time they saw themselves represented in media, the first time they'd ever heard about someone like them. But there was another musician who lived almost the exact same years as Tipton and does not get nearly as much attention. My fellow Texan, Willmer Little Axe Broadnax. Broadnax was a gospel singer who performed in various bands over the years, including the Spirit of Memphis Quartet, the Fairfield Four, and Little Axe and the Golden Echoes, which I think is one of the coolest band names of all time. He often performed with his brother, who was nicknamed Big Axe, and therefore Willmer became Little Axe because he was smaller and younger. My brother and I kind of had similar nicknames in high school. Although whether Little Axe was actually younger is a bit disputed. Broadnax lived as a man throughout his life, and like Tipton, his birth assignment wasn't discovered until his death. And that complicates some of the census records historians have used to try to piece together Broadnax's childhood. It's possible he assumed the name of one of his brothers after his brother's death in early childhood. We're not really sure though. But however he came to live the life he did, there is no doubt he was an exceptionally talented gospel singer, with a strong career spanning from the 30s through the 70s, playing with some of the top bands during the golden age of gospel. And since Broadnax had a higher voice, and gospel quartets at the time were gendered, meaning that he sung with all men, he would sometimes combine his vocals with a baritone bandmate's, creating the really cool illusion of there being one single multi-octave singer, instead of two with opposite ranges. Broadnax retired from touring as the market for gospel quartets dwindled, but still recorded and performed through the 80s. His life ended tragically in 1992, in his 70s, when, at least according to a few sources, he was stabbed to death by his girlfriend following a fight between the two of them. Musicologist and Tufts University professor Stephen Pennington points out that even though Broadnax had a much more prolific career, Billy Tipton became much more famous after death. And part of this is due to the acceptable 1950s archetypes that Tipton upheld and which Broadnax bucked against. Tipton was white, suburban, middle class, had kids. Broadnax was black, urban, unmarried, didn't have kids, and pushed against gender norms, even as he was read as male, by singing higher parts and drawing on traditions from black women gospel singers. Pennington wrote, "This trans man of color from the 1950s can serve not only to illuminate the ways in which men of color have constructed masculinity differently, but also to challenge the stability of 1950s gender constructions that are continuously evoked, spoken or unspoken, by conservative politicians and transgender passing guides alike. Broadnax's existence challenges the normalized constructions of trans masculinity as rooted in whiteness, and his vocal performance of gospel expands the possibilities of black trans masculinity to include solidarity with black women rather than opposition to them." While the original master tapes of some of Broadnax's music were lost in that 2008 fire at Universal Studios that accidentally destroyed materials from hundreds of artists, there are tons of recordings that you can still find on YouTube, as well as some on Spotify, and there's quite a few used vinyls floating around out there too. I definitely encourage you to spend some time listening to anything from Little Axe that you can get your hands on. He was an incredible talent who deserves far more attention. And now, two more men who were quasi-contemporaries of the last, but whose work was focused more in the latter half of the 20th century. Two men who lived openly as trans men, and who, in different ways, built the foundation on which so many transmasculine people are able to live authentically today. First was the man who proposed the title for the video, Reed Erickson, who I like to think of as the trans Tony Stark. He did not have a fusion-powered suit of armor, but he was nonetheless a genius billionaire playboy and philanthropist. Specifically, he was the first female assigned at birth person to get a master's degree in mechanical engineering from Louisiana State University. And his money, like Tony Stark's, originally came from his family's not great business, in this case a lead smelting company. And technically, Erickson was only a multi-millionaire, not a billionaire like Tony Stark, but still. And just like Tony Stark funded much of the Avengers, Erickson set up the Erickson Educational Foundation, or EEF. And through that, as well as other foundations, he provided funding to the very first gender clinic in the US at Johns Hopkins University, as well as to Harry Benjamin, the author of The Transsexual Phenomenon, and at the time, one of the leading sexologists helping trans people access treatment, although not completely unproblematically. Erickson provided funding to numerous gender clinics and research departments all over the country, but he didn't just throw money at them, he was actively involved. EEF published educational pamphlets for trans people, created a support and referral system for trans people to connect with one another, maintained databases of support groups, newsletters, and safe healthcare professionals. They also did tons of advocacy and educational outreach to get cis people to understand trans people and our needs. You can look at so many people and organizations doing work on trans issues in the 60s and 70s and eventually find a paper trail that leads back to Reed Erickson. Sociologist Aaron DeVores and historian Nicholas Matt say that his contributions are difficult to overestimate. As they say, Reed Erickson and EEF actively directed the course of trans research and contemporary social services and policies affecting trans people. Erickson's general vision, combined with his ability to put this vision into practice, had a major impact on trans history and has significantly influenced our present social circumstances. Of course, being a multimillionaire, he was a pretty eccentric dude, to put it mildly. He had a pet leopard named Henry, who he considered his best friend. He owned a nudist colony, and he eventually became a New Age spiritualist interested in mental telepathy, especially with animals, and was a heavy user of psychedelics. He built his own compound in Mexico that he called the Lovejoy Palace Ashram, where he did ultimately die of cancer in 1992 after fleeing drug charges in the US. A kind of dismal ending for a man to whom we owe so much. But now, finally, we come to Lou Sullivan. Born in 1951 in Wisconsin, Sullivan was a writer, an activist, a founding member of the GLBT Historical Society, back then just called the Gay and Lesbian Historical Society, and the founder of only the second ever FTM support group. Originally simply called FTM, the group also disseminated the FTM newsletter, in which Sullivan published useful information, historical profiles, and more, and sent it to people all around the world. Historically, and in many cases still today, trans men have not gathered together as much as our trans women counterparts, for a whole host of reasons. And you can see that in most of the people I featured so far in the series, who either lived stealth their whole lives, or were out trying to make it on their own without, as far as we know, other transmasculine people to guide them or to share with. Historian Emily Skidmore wrote in her book True Sex, "Trans men at the start of the 20th century often sought to pass as normative men, aligning themselves with the values of their chosen communities rather than seeking consolation in the presence of other queer individuals." Lou Sullivan was one of the ones who changed that. He was a relentless community organizer and staunch advocate for trans men of all types. Sullivan was also gay, potentially the first openly, publicly gay trans man. And because of this, he faced repeated rejection from both the gay and trans communities, as well as from medical professionals, being turned down for various transition-related care and procedures multiple times because of his sexuality. He was also a prolific diarist, having kept a constant journal since he was 10 years old. And he published a biography of one famous trans man that I haven't covered in the series yet, writer Jack B. Garland, who was also probably gay. Sullivan devoted his life to trans activism, especially to increasing the visibility of and community support for trans men, and fighting for the rights of trans people who were also gay, something that most doctors insisted wasn't possible at the time. If Reed Erickson and his money helped shift the trajectory of trans people's access to social services, Lou Sullivan helped shift the narrative about who we could be. In 1986, Sullivan was diagnosed as HIV positive. Understanding of and support for AIDS was still horrifically lacking at the time, so his prospects, like so many others, were grim. But he ended up living for 5 more years, writing and fighting for trans rights the whole time. He died on March 2nd, 1991, in his sister's arms. Before he passed away, he did a series of video interviews with psychiatrist Dr. Ira B. Pauley, and spoke what has become one of his most memorable lines. I feel like in a way, this AIDS diagnosis, because AIDS is still seen at this point as a gay man's disease, that it kind of proves that I did do it, and that I was successful. And I took a kind of perverse pleasure in contacting the gender clinics that rejected me and said that, you know, they've told me so many years that it was impossible for me to live as a gay man, but it looks like I'm going to die like one. But I want to end with another one of his quotes that has always resonated so strongly with me. In his journal, when he was 13, Lou Sullivan wrote, "I want to look like what I am, but don't know what someone like me looks like. I mean, when people look at me, I want them to think, there's one of those people that has their own interpretation of happiness. That's what I am." If you want to read some of Lou Sullivan's diaries, which Susan Stryker calls one of the most complete and most compelling records of a trans life ever to have been produced, I recommend this recent selected collection of those diaries, lovingly put together by Ellis Martin and Zach Ozma, which also just has, like, the gayest cover ever. I mean, I think Lou would have adored it. Up until these last few men, there will always be some debates as to the true internal feelings of all of the folks that I've brought up in this series. You know, our language and concepts now are different from what theirs were. And short of calling up Bill and Ted for a favor, we have no way to ask them. But I think what historian Jen Mannion wrote in the book Female Husbands about Dr. Alan Hart can be applied to so many of our would-be transcestors who dared to live their truths, and fits well with that Lou Sullivan quote. Mannion wrote, "For Hart, there was one binary. Happiness versus unhappiness. They chose happiness." There are so many more individuals I could have included here. It was hard to pare it down, and I also wrote so much more about each of them originally, but it was like a 3-hour-long video, so I might make more videos going more in-depth about each of these folks and about other trans or gender non-conforming people from history, mostly transmasculine, but not exclusively. So let me know in the comments which of these folks you'd most like to learn more about, or if there's someone else I didn't bring up yet who you think I should make a video about, let me know. In the meantime, if you want to keep up with me, you can subscribe to this channel and follow me at JackIsNotABird on Twitter and Instagram. You can also listen to my daily podcast, The Kottke Ride Home, or pick up a copy of my book, Sorted, where I followed in the footsteps of Antonio de Arauzo, Michael Dillon, and Lou Sullivan by writing down my personal history in my own words for future generations to read. And with that, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.